This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The topic is soap operas. I have two people who are experts in it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. My guests in talking about soap operas are Amanda Reyes and Lee Harrington. Lee is on the left. Amanda is on the right. Amanda has appeared on a couple of other shows that I did on game shows and television in general. And Lee is my first-time guest. So let me ask you, Lee, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself. I know you've written a book about soap opera some years ago. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what drew you to soap operas.
Yeah, I've been watching soap operas since probably the late 70s when I was a teenager in Florida. And when I went to get my PhD in sociology, I had not intended for soap opera to be a kind of topic of study. And through a very happenstance set of circumstances, I ended up writing about soap operas starting in the late 80s. So I've been watching for decades and writing for decades. I love soaps. For me, they're like a good novel that just never ends. So they're a great pop culture form.
Now, Amanda Reyes has a blog, Made for TV Mayhem. As I mentioned, she's appeared on several other shows. Amanda, if you could give a little background about yourself and what started you watching and what draws you to soap operas.
Sure. Yeah, I write a lot about television on my blog, and I have a book coming out, which we can talk about at the end, I guess. And I love TV in all its forms, especially old TV. I don't watch so much new, except soap operas. I grew up on soaps. I started watching One Life to Live in General Hospital when I was about 10. I was actually younger with General Hospital, but One Life to Live is the soap that stuck with me. I watched it till it ended. I watched it for over 30 years. I watched it in its online incarnation. And I did watch other soaps as I grew up, but I found that one was the most compelling. And as I came to love it, I came to love soaps as an art form. And so through the years, I also picked up Days of Our Lives, Young and the Restless, and currently I'm watching General Hospital and Young and the Restless. I just think it's a wonderful format. I agree, there's like great novels that never end. As a matter of fact, one of the best books I can think of about soap operas is called Worlds Without End.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what's so compelling about them. And also I like looking at the private lives of these people that are often really relatable, even in these really outrageous circumstances, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, now, I want to talk in broad strokes before we get to the history of soap operas. Both of you are obviously female. I'm a male. And one of the big cliches about soap operas was that they are for women rather than just for males. How did that first come about, and were soap operas first geared towards the female market, since at least the daytime soaps?
They were. Lee probably knows this a little bit better, but I think Erna Phillips sort of brought it to television, and she was really interested in product placement, and the shows were marketed towards women as a consumer, and so that was built into the show because it was airing in a time slot where it was usually women watching, and that's why you saw a lot of the domestic in early soaps, and you saw it all through the history, but they tried different things. General Hospital, took it somewhere else completely. But An Edge of Night was actually geared towards, I think, maybe both audiences, and that might be unique in its creation. But in general, I think, yes, they were targeted towards women, mostly because of they were airing at a time when women were generally at home and men were at work.
Yes, absolutely. From the early radio soaps to the early TV soaps, serial television was discovered to be the ideal way to connect advertisers to audiences. And so it was very much about women as consumers, women as sort of the governor of the household, and the products that were advertised in those slots were initially designed to speak to female consumers. And it took a long time, I think, for critics to realize the extent to which there was a male viewership and who those male viewers were. And there have always been males who love soaps, but you're correct in that the daytime placement of them meant that they were originally designed for female audiences, for sure.
Now, we're going to talk mostly about American soap operas, since all three of us are American. I'll briefly probably get into some other things like telenovelas and the British soaps and Australian soaps that are popular around the world. But is soap opera, as far as you guys both know, is that something like comic books or jazz that's strictly an American invention, or comic strips,
Well, soap operas draw on a really ancient literary tradition, and so there are, precursors to the soap opera form, throughout literature, throughout kind of oral history. But soap opera, the way we describe the term, Americans are credited with first launching them on radio and moving them to television. But there are now so many different serial versions around the world that, that soap opera itself is usually associated with the United States. But there are now so many different wonderful iterations of the form.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the British, though, have probably done it in a way that it's maintained its relevancy a little bit better than it has here. And that might be because they concentrate on a working class, and more so than the escapism that was so prevalent in the 80s, but maybe not as relatable in the new millennium.
Yeah. Right, exactly. The UK soaps have always been seen as a bit more realistic than the American soaps, which are more escapist, romantic fantasy oriented, and some of the more wilder incarnations in the past few decades. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, the very first soap opera that I watched on a regular basis actually wasn't an American soap. It was the late '70s. I watched Prisoner Cell Block H. Gorgeous Aussie babes in prison. At least some of them. Some of them were big and butch, but there were a lot of beautiful accented babes in prison. But then I've seen, for example, a few of the Netflix episodes of Orange Is the New Black, and I look at something like that, and I can't relate to any of those characters. They're poorly written. And then I think back to the glory days of that Prisoner Cell Block H, and you would have characters that were doing, and this is an Australian soap, so you would have characters that weren't having necessarily these grand adventures, but were dealing with maybe one character might have been upset because a pet sparrow she had in her cell died or something, and the whole episode would be about that, these relatable things. You mentioned, I think, Lee, you mentioned about, or maybe it was Amanda mentioned about them dealing with working class issues. Is the difference that American soap operas sprung or got really popular after the post-World War II boom, when America was, the king of the world, whereas the British soaps, from what I've read, started during that the era of social realist, what do they call it, the sink tub, or the soap, films based like that.
I don't know enough about the history of British soap operas to speak to that, but I mean, soap operas have had so many different incarnations in terms of I guess throughout the history of them, they always were like two rival families or concentrated on a family, and so it was very domestic when it started, and a little bit, it was like, and those primetime anthology shows in terms of aesthetics and being in the privacy of the home, but I think that's an interesting point you bring up about post-war. Maybe people wanted more fantasy. I mean, I think each decade of soap, you might be able to break into chunks and see what was the cultural touchstone of the audience each decade. So I don't know if I can answer your question, but I do think that there's an ebb and flow to soaps. But I feel like when the 80s they were at their peak and they hit this high fantasy format, they haven't really been able to recover from that, I think, in terms of capturing the audience. And so you'll see these 4 soap operas that are left do things so differently from each other, but they have very small audiences now.
Yeah.
Right, and I agree with that. I mean, the history in the U.S. has been so long that I think some of the early radio and TV soaps, in which they were almost moralistic, there were the idea that there were sort of lessons to be learned from. The lessons were very explicitly made, to the audience. And Agnes Nixon, who brought socially relevant storytelling to, love Agnes Nixon, brought socially relevant storytelling to soaps, and that has continued, and lots of sort of embrace and criticize that. And then, the big budgets in the 1980s and the ability to do on-location shoots all around the world just became a kind of different beast.
Well, let's talk about the origin of the term soap opera. I believe Guiding Light was the last, I think, a soap opera that was produced, that was funded by Procter & Gamble, the big soap producer here in the U.S. I think those started on radio back in the 30s. So soap operas did start on radio. Other than the fact that there weren't any moving images, was there a difference between radio soap operas and how they first appeared on television, say in the 50s?
Well, they were very static. It was kind of trying to carry over the radio format. Like I said, it was much like those primetime anthology shows, where it was very it had more of a theater aesthetic to it. And there was it was kind of plain, I think. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of the old because a lot of it doesn't exist anymore, but my understanding is that it was very plain to look at, but it was that the stories were compelling. So they were taking the stories and the heart. I guess the dialogue was probably richer, but yeah, visually it was just very much like putting a chair somewhere and a table and hoping for the best. You know what I mean? They didn't have a lot of set design.
Right. Often it would be just a kitchen, maybe a kitchen and a living room, but one view of the kitchen and living room. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the people who worked both behind the scenes and the actors, they came from the world of theater, and so the dramatic style and tendencies sort of flowed through the early soaps, even the early TV soaps, and then in the 60s and 70s, they just became very different creatures. And General Hospital introducing this hospital set was legendary, and what Gloria Monty did in the 70s and Agnes Nixon in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, and so lots of different versions of what soaps have been.
I started watching in the late 1970s. A friend, other than Prison of Cell Block H, which aired on independent stations here in the late 70s in the U.S., the first network soap that I tried to watch, some friends of mine when I was 10, 11, 12 or whatnot, tried to get me to watch Days of Our Lives, and I think the character of Marlena, played by Deidre Hall, first came on around that era. And that was, I believe, and still is, an NBC soap, and I was bored to tears with it. And then a couple of years later, when Tony Geary started on General Hospital as Luke Spencer, I started watching that, and I liked the fact that there was a mafia family that he was working with. Then they had some sci-fi adventures through the early 80s. And I basically became an ABC soap guy. I watched All My Children and General Hospital regularly. When one sort of went in the tank, I watched the other more voraciously. And I would also watch One Life to Live here and there as well, depending on whether the stories waned and waxed. Has there been a tradition, at least in the U.S., that the CBS and the ABC and the NBC soaps had different aesthetics? Because I just interviewed a fellow named Brian Patrick Clark a few days ago who played Grant Putnam on General Hospital, and he said that he enjoyed the General Hospital stint, but when he went to Bold and Beautiful, he was bored out of his mind because he said there was so much beauty but very little boldness.
Well, I think the ownership patterns of the soaps do matter in terms of what they look like. So, Young and the Restless and Bold and the Beautiful, it's the same sort of production family behind it, and so they're often seen as, and they are, sister soaps to one another. The ABC soaps were, ABC is owned by Disney, but ABC owned their own soaps, if I'm getting this correct. And so there was a certain sort of a look and style to ABC soaps, and NBC contracted their soaps. So Cordry family, I believe, behind Days of Our Lives. And so there was a sense for many viewers that CBS soaps were different than ABC and NBC, and you often had, one channel devotees. I too was an ABC person, mostly. And so I do think there was a stylistic history behind them.
There's some interesting facts about, well, I don't know if it's a fact, but theories about that. So I was reading about Ryan's Hope, and Ryan's Hope was a very traditional soap that came kind of after the traditional soaps. But then it was very popular, but then it was on ABC, and it got stuck in this sort of hyper-stylized block of soaps, and it started to lose viewership because it was sort of not in the same vein as the other three shows that were on. And I don't know if Loving was on at the time, but they were all they were more about the larger fantasies, and Ryan's Hope was really about this family. And so they tried to attach themselves sort of to this new version of the soap, and it didn't work for them, and then they got canceled. So you're right. I mean, in terms of at least ABC and my knowledge of it, people were coming to the shows for a certain look and feel, probably kind of stories that interested them, and they were all sort of grouped by these series of soaps that aired on this network. And so Ryan's Hope is a good example of how if you veer from that off the channel, then you might lose your audience.
Right, and I think I can point to a handful of soaps that brought a very different aesthetic to their network, and with varying success. So Santa Barbara, which is a soap that I loved, known for its an unusual degree of humor in its storylines. Obviously Port Charles with the vampires. Generations, which only lasted a few years, but was really radical in its for African American and white families. And so there have been some bold experiments to sort of break away from the network style. with greater and lesser success over the years.
Well, let's talk about what was the first U.S. American daytime soap opera that I guess stuck and made it big, and then clearly there had to be other people say, "Well, they're doing it. Let's make a soap opera of our own." Was it Guiding Light or Search for Tomorrow? Or?
I'm not positive of that, but those are all like Erna Phillips creations. I don't know which one was the breakout, but I feel like she was behind whatever ended up becoming the staple of daytime.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, she was able to sort of, launch her name in radio, make the transition from radio to television, and I would think Guiding Light, but that's only because it lasted so long. And maybe there was an earlier incarnation that was the groundbreaker that I'm just not thinking of. I'm not a historian particularly, so I'm not familiar with that either.
Well, when we talk about genres like soap opera, every genre, whether it's a writing genre in terms of novels, whether it's musical genres, has its own sort of techniques. And in soap operas, for example, when a commercial's about to come, someone's about to speak and they'll freeze, and they'll pause for 5 or 6, I'm constipated now, Irma. I've got to go to the bathroom. Boom, and how did that
Phillips creation.
Yeah.
So I was reading that they were expanding one of her shows. I can't remember which one, from 15 minutes to half an hour, and it was actually sort of a request not to have necessarily more story, but to concentrate on the nuance of the scenes. So she wanted real time. So like when you sat down to have a cup of coffee with somebody in a scene, she wanted to explore having a cup of coffee like people would. And so it sort of ended up working its way into that very like static. I love it. Don't get me wrong. Tina Lord on One Life to Live did it better than anybody when they cut to commercial. Those big eyes, and she was like, and for like 5-10 seconds. But it actually started as a way to learn more about the characters and to make them more realistic.
Right. And I do think, one of the things that I always have loved about soaps is the idea that, a Wednesday in Port Charles is a Wednesday in real life, and that they are designed to mimic the flows of everyday, despite the kind of outlandish storytelling. But that's one of the reasons they get criticized for people who don't know all of the sort of history and nuances of the genre. You can walk into a room and know that it's a soap opera on television. And for some people, it's, those long, seemingly blank stares, nothing seems to be happening. It's the repetition where people repeat the same thing over and over and over. And there's a very clear reason for that historically. The idea was that, if soaps are designed for homemakers doing work in their home, she might be out changing the laundry or feeding the child. So in order for her not to miss pieces of information, it was repeated over and over and over. But it can be frustrating for people who don't understand those conventions and don't understand why these things are happening.
Another trope that I just want to mention, and I'll mention a few others, is the bad guy, and there's a website called TV Tropes, the bad guy constantly over-explaining why he or she is doing something. If the bad person, let's say it's a jealous ex-girlfriend trying to set up her ex-lover to look like he's cheating on his current girlfriend, she'll eventually tell her plot. Haha, yes, I'm the one who spiked his drink and whatnot and got into bed with him and took photographs. It's like, no one does that in real life, But is that another thing that was just a thing to sort of fill out the time?
Well, it expresses motivation, and so, I feel like it kind of adds character, because they don't just confess, they tell you why, and there's usually a legacy behind why. There's always like families with these huge histories. So like currently right now in Young and the Restless, Jill got a letter from Catherine. Catherine, the actress who played Catherine, has been dead for like at least 4 years, and yet her character has been on the front burner since she died. And so these things are happening with Jill and this person who passed away, and they're explaining these things about their relationship, but that's because there's such a legacy behind their rivalry. And it's not just like I just poisoned your drink. It's because I poisoned your drink because our family had our land stolen from you, 10 years ago, and my brother committed suicide because he was supposed to take over our oil field. That's Dallas or something, but you know what I mean. And so it's like it's meant to connect audiences. I mean, this is my interpretation of it, to the character in a more deeper fashion. And a lot of times, so like a really good example might be Todd Manning, who was a rapist on One Life to Live. And he was a really despicable character, but they gave him so much backstory and they explained it in ways that his father had raped him. And they did all these things where they actually turned a pretty unredeemable character into somebody that you could watch and understand. And I think that's, to me, the main point of those like long scenes of like confessionals and things like that.
Yeah, I think it deepens history. It deepens character. It's a way for a show to draw on its own really complex narrative history. And it's also handy for the viewer who might not be watching 5 days a week. They might only watch Friday's show and they think, I don't know what the heck just happened. And so it provides that explanation for someone who might be someone who is only able to dip in and out of soaps.
Well, let me talk about a few other of these tropes that are pretty much unique to soap operas. There's something called SORA, or soap opera rapid aging, or soap opera rapid aging syndrome, where a child is born in the year 2000. In the year 2005, he's a teenager, and by 2010, he has a doctor's degree and is performing at the hospital in just a decade. I've always thought that was just a terrible, terrible idea, because some of the favorite characters, especially if they miscast or give the sordid character bad storylines, by the time they would actually hit that age, you would be going through these things more naturally. It just seems to me a terrible idea. On General Hospital, most of the children now have been so rapidly aged. For example, the character of Elizabeth Weber, played by Rebecca Herbst, had a child born, I think, in '02, who's now just barely becoming a teen. So he's actually not aging quickly, and other children who are born 5-6 years later are already teenagers, and it makes no sense. What is the rationale behind it?
There's a character on not General Hospital, Young and the Restless now, that they just reintroduced named Reed, and he is a teenager, and he should actually be the same age as the 9-year-old girl on the show that plays Faith. I think it's more just a general, because soaps are really looking for a younger audience, because a lot of their traditional audiences are dying off or they're leaving, and so I think they do that as a way to introduce characters that are young and vibrant, but not kids, because kids can't get into the same kind of mischief that an adult can and get away with it. So it's more of I don't know what the word I want to use is, a method to integrate, hip younger characters into the scene that have a history with the show already.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think it's a writerly strategy. So giving birth is interesting narratively, but warrior girls are not interesting narratively, or 10-year-olds. And 20 years ago, even the 15-year-old wouldn't have been interesting on soaps. But because of the necessity of the younger demographic, they are writing more meaty storylines for 15 and 16 and 17-year-old characters. The actors might not be that age, but the characters are that age. But yeah, it's a way to move past times of the life that they can't figure out what to do with from a writer's perspective.
Yeah. Another thing that annoys the hell out of me, and I know a lot of other people when I go on soap boards, are things they call retcons, or retroactive continuities, which was borrowed, I guess, from a lot of the comic strips with the constant rebirth of Superman and stuff. And I think of, on my ABC soaps, some of the most dreadful ones was Erica Kane having an abortion, supposedly, and then finding out it's a son that was kept by Dr. Greg Madden and whatnot. And then, more recently, the thing that really angered me and a lot of General Hospital fans was the Lucas Fluke storyline, where they basically threw out 35 years of character history, totally destroyed two families from there, and they did it basically on the whim of the actor who wanted to go, Tony Geary. It seems to me that this is part of the insularity of the soap operas. Back when, in the 80s and 90s, when we had these whole newspapers devoted to soap operas, when we had 15 or 17 on the air, they seemed to be more interested. When they would get two characters accidentally paired and they had chemistry, they go, oh, we've got a budding super couple here. Nowadays, they seem tone deaf to what, the fans on General Hospital, for example, are sick and tired of Sonny Corinthos and the Mafia, but they don't listen. So talk to me about retcons. Was this borrowed directly from comic strips or comic books? And why do they do it so badly, it seems?
Well, I don't know if it was borrowed directly from comic strips. And again, I think partly it's a narrative strategy. I mean, if they get to a point where they basically just need to rewrite history to make the story that they're currently telling work. I think in terms of General Hospital, I watched the whole Luke Fluke debacle. I think the retcon was the Luke Laura rape retcon, it was a rape, which they rewrote as a seduction, and then they rewrote it again as a rape, so that Luke could tell Lucky and describe to Lucky what had happened between him and Laura, and it was a remarkable retcon, which rarely happens, but they recorrected the retcon. I can't explain Luke Fluke. That was just something else.
Well, General Hospital, I didn't mind the Luke Fluke thing so much. I feel like General Hospital went to a place that was really postmodern under Ron, I don't know if I can say his last name, Calavarti's
Calavati, yeah.
Yeah, in general, I think he was really brilliant, especially at the beginning when he came over to... I'm a One Life to Live, and that's where he came from, so I was already dedicated to him. And when he came over to General Hospital with the poison water story and everything, that was fantastic. But he went places that were really strange, especially for soap opera audiences. They don't think in a postmodern kind of narrative. And, so he does things that are, really weird to people. Now, I agree it probably doesn't work to take all these years and try to rewrite the history of it, but there's something about the way he did it that was really compelling to me. So, and I'm also a really easy soap viewer. I will take a lot. I will put up with a lot. For instance, Young and the Restless, they had two Jacks for a while. They had Jack, and then he got kidnapped by Victor Newman, and then they brought in a twin. Well, he was basically raping Phyllis because she was sleeping with this man that wasn't really her husband, and that's disgusting. But while I was watching the show, I took it with a grain of salt. But soap opera fans, you're right, really reacted strongly to it because it's really offensive, in its core. But I'm one of those kind of people that I just let the story do what it has to do. I'm more for the payoff and the sort of the catharsis of the emotion, not so much the actual story itself. I just like to share in the emotional aspect of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Given budget cuts, over the past 10 or 15 years, I don't know the extent to which the soaps have the continuity experts that they used to. People whose sole job was to track the history.
Oh, not only continuity, but medical and legal experts. All the time people are bitching about a lawyer would never say that, or a doctor should know this.
Right, and the writers come and go more rapidly. Sometimes the actors know their character's history way better than the writers or producers of the show. And so I think continuity is sometimes deliberately sacrificed, and sometimes it's just overlooked because nobody but the viewer, and the viewers do remember what happened 20 years ago. But often the production team, is moving very quickly and might not have that continuity check the way they used to.
Yeah, I know what the Luke Fluke thing, the thing that annoyed me and a lot of people that I interacted with on online web boards was we could even take the retcons where the Fluke retcon about Luke's father basically made Aunt Ruby, a beloved character, into a pathological liar about her whole family for decades. I could have taken that, but they were so sloppy in doing that, they would have in the same episode the good Luke tied up in the sanitarium, and then show Fluke outside the sanitarium interacting with people, but then they made him just an aspect of Luke's mind. Well, did everyone else share in the delusion that Fluke was running around when the real Luke was tied up? And it's like, okay, so now we've entered Rod Serling thing here.
Yeah, but think about how they wrap that up with that beautiful story that Ron put together where they went back into their family's past. Remember that episode that was shot in black and white? And they showed how Luke was his father, right? And that was so beautifully done. I feel like the payoff was worth it to me because what we got was something that was so rich in history in the terms of they started it on the way the very first episode started, on that floor in the hospital with different actors playing those exact characters that came from the original scene of the first episode. I'm getting chills just talking about it. I feel like I can take that because what I got at the end was so freaking beautiful. It was so well done. It was worth it to me. I'm not a nitpicker, I guess, and I'm not saying you're a nitpicker.
Well, I am, and the thing that got me about that particular episode was the young Luke. You could see him. His eyes turn left, and he's reading off the dummy cards or whatever they call them. I'm like, oh God, this kid is such a terrible actor. The female, the young girl who's now on playing a new character, is a terrific actress. She's great, but the young Luke made me cringe.
And Carly as the mother, I mean, oh my God, it was a revelation, right? She was so amazing. I mean, so to me, in the end, that when I think back on that storyline, I think back about that ending to it. Yeah. I loved it.
Well, and I think that's one of the things I love about soaps, and that makes soaps so unique, is that viewers will sit through, 5 years of bad story because they're invested in the bigger story. And, I'll abandon a primetime show halfway through a season if it's not engaging me, but I'll sit through 2 years of bad story because I'm sure it'll come back right around. So, so viewers are unique in their loyalty that way, I think.
Well, let me talk about one of the more noxious soap tropes that was especially in the 1980s. We talked about the Luke and Laura rape retcon and re-retcon. You mentioned Todd Manning. I would throw in Sonny Corinthos from ABC because people forget that he was dropping drugs into his strippers' drinks, and he came on basically as a serial rapist. That's totally been retconned. But it seemed that ABC especially had what we called the bad girl syndrome. Every bad girl on that soap was raped to be a good girl on those soaps. Laura, Erica Kane, the Gloria Marsh character, Elizabeth Weber. And it's like, in what perverse universe do we get a troubled woman who may be a bitch become a good saintly choir girl simply because she's raped? And you had Tony Geary talks about how he cringed when women would rape me, Luke, and similarly Todd Manning's portrayal, Roger Howarth, said that he didn't want to come back to the character for many years because of that. So let me just talk about, was there something just bizarre in the late 70s and early 80s where there were female rape fantasies? Because these were written mostly by women, these storylines.
I'm going to let Lee tackle that one. That's a really interesting theory. I hadn't thought about the rape the girl till she's good, but you're right, that was sort of prevalent in the storyline she brought up.
And was it just ABC? Was it just ABC, or did other soaps do it? Other networks?
I don't know either. I mean, I now that you mention the connections between all those, I can see that line running through it. But I think there's been so much more press attention in soap magazines to the rapists rather than the rape victims, and that alone should give us pause. So I don't really know the answer to that. That is, that's a good observation.
Well, let me talk about one final one before we move on and talk a bit more about sort of the history. I was just, as I mentioned, I had interviewed Brian Patrick Clark, who played a couple of characters on General Hospital during its golden age, I call it, of the 1980s. And I went back to just refamiliarize myself with some of his storyline. And some people, fans, will edit these things, and you have to be very careful because the editing is very hit and miss. Sometimes you're missing whole scenes that should be there. But the pacing of soaps in the golden age was much more slow in a good sense, because there were scenes, for example, where Clark's character and Sherilyn Walter, who played his honey there, Celia, had, between all the commercials, would have 5 or 6 minutes of an argument, and they were the only ones on them. Now you can't, if you get 90 seconds on a soap opera, that's a long edit where people are. It's this constant ADD editing, and it just drives me goddamn crazy, because I remember, for example, just to stick with General Hospital, I remember one episode, the last one with Bill Eckert and his son Sly Eckert, and Bill gave, played by Tony Geary, before he was killed off to replay Luke, he gave, I think, one of the best father and son half-hour speeches to his son, and you could get it was so touching. You couldn't get that today. You could not get that today. What has happened that has made this ADD editing so prevalent, at least in daytime soaps?
That's a Gloria Monty invention, actually. She didn't like the long spaces of scenes. So we were talking about when they expanded the soap to half an hour to catch the nuances. She came in and sort of redesigned General Hospital and made those scenes shorter. And because the show was so popular, people started to mimic it, and it just became a thing. I also think it has to do with the fact that networks in particular, and maybe people who run the soaps directly, don't have faith in viewers, because we live in such an ADD culture where we have a remote control in our hand and we're constantly switching from channel to channel. And so the whole point is to keep it sort of going so that there's an interesting thing happening every 90 seconds that's like different. And so I think the combination of the two have sort of culminated in what you're talking about. And I agree with you. I do think Young and the Restless does it a little bit better. I feel like they do concentrate a little bit, depending on the story. They will spend some time with their characters. General Hospital is very like, and I feel like maybe Ron did a little bit more with that as well, because that was a really swiftly paced show when he grabbed it. But yeah, I think it was a Gloriamonte convention actually.
And I do think I agree with that. And I think the other piece of the puzzle is the declining viewership. And as more and more viewers fled the genre, people were basically panicking behind the scenes. And so, sacrificing character for plot and throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the camera as a way to retain viewers. And I think, what was originally a narrative convention became a budgetary flail, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a bit more about the decline here in America, at least a little bit later on. Since we talked basically about daytime soap operas thus far, let me talk a little bit about primetime soap operas. And we mentioned British soap operas. And from what I've read, most of the successful British soap operas do air 5 times a week in prime time in Britain. Whereas here, there was always a distinction between primetime soaps like Peyton Place, Dallas, Dynasty, and daytime soaps. Obviously, there's 5 times. In America we only did 1 a week rather than 5 times a week like they do in Britain. But were there other conventions in primetime soap operas from the 60s through, I guess, even today that are different from daytime soaps, and why?
Well, they're just more cinematic. They had bigger budgets because they were doing it once a week, and they were able to sort of do those. Different location shoots and have people in more expensive clothes and doing more glamorous, wonderful things because they could afford to do that. So, I think that's what marks them as so different. And that might be why when you're watching, like, I always refer to One Life to Live, so forgive me, but, like, if you look at Victoria Lord, she is filthy rich, but they live a very domestic sort of, very relatable lifestyle. But then when you go to Dynasty, oh my gosh, that's like, that they're filthy rich. You know what I mean? It's flaunted. And so that's the major difference I can see. It was less about the domestic in primetime and more about the let's see how extravagant we can be. It was more about the public, I guess, in a way.
There's also that interesting era, and I don't even remember quite when it was, when there was just more linkage between daytime and primetime. So there would be, for example, the anniversary of another shown in prime time, and a special episode of Days of Our Lives that would be in prime time. And in part, that was a way to attract new viewers to the show, but also just more porous boundaries between daytime and prime time, and that disappeared. And I don't even quite remember when. We haven't seen any of those things in a long time.
It also seems that a lot of genres on primetime television have adopted serialized formulas. I think some of the cop shows from the 80s first started doing that, where you would have story arcs carry over, where it used to be, if you watch Hawaii Five-0 or Perry Mason, each episode was self-contained. And we've seemingly lost episodic television, at least in prime time, for a lot of shows that you would think should be episodic, because they think that serializing the stories are better, and yet the very daytime serials seem to not be popular. So it's just kind of bizarre that daytime soap operas have been fading for the last 20 plus years, but primetime shows, even outside normal genres of soap operas, have adopted the soap opera format. Any comment on why that may be?
Yeah, Hill Street Blues in 1981, I think, is credited with, as the first show to successfully do that, and in part because primetime did have bigger budgets. For a while, they've been doing serialized television, in a sense, better than daytime. And so people who are attracted to serial narratives can now find it in both daytime, primetime, online, in lots of different places. And primetime is doing serialized television great in a lot of different instances.
I'm just going to say we was robbed. It really irks me when people are like, The Walking Dead is so good. And I'm like, well, it's a soap opera. No, it's not. Like, they get so upset when you like attach the two together. But it's exactly what it is. And I wish people, you don't have to watch the soap, but I would like to see more respect because they created what is so prevalent today and what people love about TV. And it's like, just give us some credit, you know?
No, I know. And I have a whole lot of colleagues who study media who insist there's nothing about daytime soap opera in these shows. And, you know, so half of us roll our eyes and say, of course there are. Of course we poached it from daytime. And other people who just vehemently disagree. But I absolutely agree with Amanda on this.
Well, let's go back to the 60s and back to daytime soap operas. You know, when I was growing up, I was born in 1965, when I would hear about soap operas, and my mother didn't watch soap operas even though she was home raising me and my sister, there was always sort of the, you know, roll of the eye condescension that you were just sort of alluding to. That, oh, it's going to be about someone's caught in an affair, you know, there's going to be the medical tragedy here or there. It seems to me that was dominant. Maybe I'm wrong, but there were a few sort of bumps. I can think of, for example, one of the first stunt castings was Joan Crawford replacing her daughter's character on a soap opera. And then after the first 6 months of a year of being in the bottom of the ratings, Dark Shadows introduced Barnabas Collins. So let's just talk about the 1960s in soap operas. Other than, well, if you want to talk about either of those two introductions, Barnabas the vampire and Joan Collins' stint, not Joan Collins, Joan Crawford's stint, what other things were really sort of essential to 1960s soap operas?
That is not one of my areas, Amanda. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Okay.
I can't. I will say though, a soap that I've been reading a little bit about that I've never seen is called Secret Storm. I think it did start in the 50s, but it actually it was psychological. So there was so much more character development back then, and the premise of that show was that a mother of a family was killed in a car accident, I think either right before the show started or right at the beginning of the show. And it was about these people, this family dealing with the loss of their mother, and they all went and they did this for years. They followed this family for years, all based on this one horrific accident. And like the daughter became really dysfunctional because she had this hole in her heart, and so there was a real psychology. And I know that doesn't answer your thing about stunt casting, but there was something about they dug deep into emotions in ways that nobody else was really doing it, and that was unique to television, I think, in a lot of ways. Now, I'm not saying anthology TV didn't do it, but soaps did it in a way that was very specific to women viewers. And so, I mean, to me, the 50s and the 60s are sort of aligned that way. Now, the whole Joan Crawford thing, I mean, that was just like a sort of a happy accident in terms of making Mommy Dearest really fun to watch. But, you know, like I don't think that there's surviving video of that either. I think because they used to tape over the shows. And that's what's so frustrating about it, too, because we can talk about 60s soaps in terms of the history that we may know about it, but the experience of it isn't really there for us because we weren't there and there's nothing really to fall back on to see. But I don't know that there was, like, stunt casting or, like, plot twists. I don't know that was really prevalent back then. It really felt like it was more about the family and what we can talk about within the family and deal with, like, the cultural anxieties. Like, I can't remember which show Agnes Nixon used to write for, but before she got to One Life to Live, and dealt with the Carla Gray story, which we can talk about. But she also was talking about, like, student activism. She wrote a storyline about protesting, and they were dealing with what we were dealing with in our everyday lives. I know all my children had Vietnam vets, I think, and dealing with PTSD before we called it that. And so it was more about, like, what we could do with what's happening right outside our door than, like, of course, the vampire thing was neat. I mean, it made it unique. Yeah. And, of course, Jonathan Frid was an amazing actor, so that helped. But also, that show didn't last very long. So, stunt casting and those, like, little tweaks don't always pay off. Right?
And the interesting thing is the Dark Shadows, I think the owner, or the guy who created it, owned the show, and he didn't allow them to be taped over. That's why you can get DVDs of Dark Shadows' whole run, except for 3 or 4 episodes, I think, that were lost. Whereas if you try to find a General Hospital episode or a Search for Tomorrow from the early 70s, it looks like it was made in 1888 or something, you know?
Yeah, no, and the archiving is so erratic, and it's such a wonderful history that's lost or incomplete. But yeah.
Well, let me just mention, since it was mentioned earlier, Edge of Night was a soap opera that was maybe the first male-geared soap opera because it was basically a bunch of DAs and lawyers solving crimes. And that lasted, I think, from the late 50s on NBC until the mid 70s when it went to ABC and ran for about another 5 or 6 years there. Amanda, did you ever watch Edge of Night, at least in its later years?
I did, and I was still a little too young for it, but I watched it sort of in retrospect because people, I run a blog and I have a Facebook page that promotes the blog, and I do a lot of stuff on soaps, or I'll post ads or whatever, and people will come on and tell me about the show. So there was one story, I took stills from it off YouTube. I don't know the entire story, but there was somebody with like a hand puppet killing people, and it was really scary. So the guy, the puppet would like show up and like watch the victim, and then he would stab the victim, I guess, with the other hand. And that had to have been way later because it's surviving and it's in color and it's a pretty crisp looking copy. But like they did some really wicked cool things because I'm also a horror fan. So it was really cool to see like when they incorporate stuff like that into the show. And I think that also because they wanted originally before they created Edge of Night to do Perry Mason in the daytime. So I think they brought over one of Perry Mason's writers or something. And so they were looking specifically for that feel and look of the lawyers, and they were very specific in what they wanted, and it was unique for the genre, but they were already taking from something that was hugely popular. So I'm not surprised that it did well and is well remembered.
Well, not a show very much.
Well, let's talk about the 1970s, and then we'll end this first segment with the 1970s, and then go on from there. But the 1970s ended with General Hospital's ascension. But before that, All My Children was always considered the issue-oriented soap on ABC. Were there other soaps on the other networks that were the issue-oriented? Did they sort of follow that? Because General Hospital started out as a traditional soap, ended up as the action soap. One Life to Live seemed to always be, to me, the most literary of the soaps. They had the most tradition, going back to sort of novels. It was most character-oriented. But All My Children, right from the beginning, with Susan Lucci dominating that soap opera, seemed to, it was always a Susan Lucci story, and then there was always the social story. So it sort of balanced between, her melodramatics and a social story. Let's talk about the 1970s in soaps, either one of you. What was some of the major tropes, some of the major shows or issues or stories?
Well, I do think, Agnes Nixon is credited, I think, with being the main figure associated with the social issue storyline. And again, lots of support for that and lots of critics of that over the years. And the radio soaps did tend to have a moralistic hue to them, and so it's not that Agnes Nixon invented this, but it became the sort of the hallmark of her shows, and then they were successful, and so other shows began to adopt some of the same conventions.
Yeah, I mentioned Carla Gray earlier, which I think is the groundbreaking story for that. So if you're not familiar with Carla Gray, she was a black woman masquerading as a white person in Landview on One Life to Live. And it was revealed to the audience before it was revealed to the characters that she was black. And she was doing this to move up through the classes. And it was really controversial. It was groundbreaking. I think it was the first time maybe a black actor had been brought in like a long-term major story. And it was just ridiculously amazing. Nobody had ever heard of anything like that. But Agnes Nixon, like I said earlier, had already been doing that. She was a head writer, and I wish I could remember which soap it was, but she was doing the things about the student protests. And I know Susan Lucci was the first character to have an abortion on a soap, and I don't know if that was in the 80s or 70s, but like
I think it first came to light in the 80s, but it was set in the 70s.
But I would also argue that it doesn't have to be a huge social issue. I think even just dealing with divorce, which a lot of the soaps had, especially in the 60s when that was still pretty taboo, was a pretty big deal. And dealing with the consequences of doing things like that. Or I don't want to fall too much on morality, because morality and social issues, I don't know, that could be really problematic. But they were dealing with things that people were actually dealing with in real life. And so to me, it's okay if it's not a big social issue. I think it's great if it is, but I don't know that the soaps relied so much on that in those decades as much as they just wanted you to get to know the characters like they were your other family.
Well, in recent years, I remember several cases of the PSA after an episode, right?
That's right.
Especially health-related. So the HIV/AIDS and breast cancer storylines and cervical cancer storylines, there were not a lot of instances, and I think mixed reactions from those critics and viewers, but those storylines were important and really getting real-life viewers to clinics and showed to have positive health benefits on the viewership, but that are infrequent.
Even Dallas adopted that because, oh my God, Barbara Bel Geddes' character had breast cancer and she had to have a mastectomy, and they dealt a lot with, like, it was a heavy duty storyline, and it wasn't just a one-off episode where she like deals with it. Like, losing her breasts and her relationship with her husband Jock was really carried through, and it was so well done. So that's actually something that I think maybe Nighttime looked at daytime for, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk about the minorities on soap operas. I know, as I said, I've been an ABC soap watcher, generally speaking. I know that General Hospital has had an abysmal record with black characters. You had Brian and Claudia, the Oreos of the late 70s and early 80s that they did nothing with. They introduced a black lover to Edward Quatermain, and they briefly had his family in the 80s. And now, you get some maybe possibly interesting characters, and they're always shunted to the third or fourth level stories. All My Children was a little bit better, I think. They didn't have many black characters, but you did have Jesse and Angie in the early 80s become the first black super couple. Then you had Erica Kane's daughter came out as a lesbian, and it was sort of the first non-stunt, at least on ABC soaps, first non-stunt gay storyline. You'd had maybe here or there a gay character who would get beaten up on the soap, and everyone would righteously say, "Don't beat up the gay character." But the Erica's daughter was the first long running. So let me just ask you both about ethnic minorities as well as gay character storylines, how they developed, or we mentioned you mentioned the black woman trying to pass as white. Was that really the first black soap actress?
Well, I don't know if she was the first black soap actress, but she was, I think, the first one to actually get a major storyline. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that they brought her in as white. And because it made audiences reflect on their own opinions, because it was revealed that she was black to them first, there was sort of a confrontation that the audience had to have with themselves, which is what was so genius about that storyline. I don't think that soaps are as integrated as they could be. I do think Young and the Restless does it pretty good because they have the Winters family, and they're great. I think, of course, Generations, although I think the stories maybe could have been stronger, was a really great attempt to bring black actors to the forefront. I agree with you on General Hospital. They have a pretty diversified cast in a lot of ways, but the characters need a little work. But like somebody asked,
they suffer from tokenism, basically. That's always been the thing.
But somebody actually contacted me after I wrote about Generations, and they said, "Would you be interested in writing about Hispanic characters on soaps?" And I would like to do that because that wasn't anything I thought about as being Hispanic. I'm kind of surprised I hadn't. And One Life to Live, of course, did it pretty good. But it's like I don't know that even that is. I don't know that they're as diversified as they could be soaps. I think that's a major problem.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I did a major study about the Bianca storyline, and I was able to interview a lot of the writers and actors involved with that, and writers basically say these are still fundamentally heterosexual families and heterosexual romances, and so you have to create stories that allow characters to date and have sex and marry one another. And from their perspective, in many ways, it's a writerly challenge. But they also agree that it's abysmal. The representation has been abysmal. And, I'm mainly a BBC person, too. And I remember around 2000 when the U.S. Census data came out and people realized the sort of surge in the Hispanic population and the popularity of telenovelas among American audiences. And suddenly every soap had a Latin quarter. They hadn't had a Latin quarter. And suddenly there were, quarter Hispanic characters. And there was real effort to diversify in that way with, again, not always success, I think.
Just to comment on that, something that I noticed, so on One Life to Live, a few years before it was canceled, they introduced two gay guys, Kyle and Fish. Fish was a cop, and Kyle was a pre-med student, and they had the first, sex scene that was, same sex, that was, an actual, like all the other soap operas, it was done just like that, and the pushback was really intense, and they had to write the characters off. So I think it has been difficult, as you say, from a writer's perspective, but also I think some of the audience is very, very, very conservative, and they do not want to see that. And to have it played in such a way that it was normalized, like these people have sex just like everybody else, and they made it erotic and beautiful and wonderful, but people were really disturbed by it, and it backfired on them. Now I wish I could remember their name. There's a gay couple on Days of Our Lives, and I think it just took a few years for people to kind of catch up to it. I think they're more accepting of this couple on that show, but it took a while to get there.
In fairness, it should be said that primetime is not much better. We've never had a black or Hispanic or gay Waltons. We don't even have white Waltons anymore. Family drama is gone. But
Sure.
Go ahead, Lee.
No, I was just going to say that, even, there are viewers who are accepting of the couples existing and the representation on screen, and there are a whole lot of viewers who will say, I'm fine if there's a gay storyline and a gay romance, just don't put it on TV. I don't want to see it. I don't want to see the physical intimacy. And so I do agree with the conservative viewership is strong and nuanced in terms of what they do and don't want to see played out on screen.
It's so bizarre. I'm sorry, just real quick. It's so bizarre what they'll put up with and what they won't. Like they love Todd Manning, who raped more than one person. You know what I mean? But Kyle and Fish, a completely monogamous same-sex couple, is horrendous to them. You know what I mean?
Lee, it's interesting you point that out, because I've often said to people, and this is just outside of television or anything, that I think the thing that people mistake about what's called homophobia is that it's not really a fear of homosexuality, but people have that kind of squishy, they squish their face, they go, ooh, I just don't want to see them kissing, and it's that kind of, I don't know what you'd call turn off or disgust of it. That's the thing that drives, I think, most bigotry against homosexuals or transsexuals or whatnot, rather than, because there are many people, and I've known religious people that will say, I don't have any problem with it, but like you said, it's just seeing it, there's something just that gets to their root. But let me, then, I mentioned, we're talking about the 70s, as we got towards the end, famously, we mentioned Gloria Monty and General Hospital, and General Hospital for its first 15 or so years was, a sort of white bread vanilla kind of soap opera, and was about to be canceled. And then when Monty came on, she decided to open things up. And I don't know if the Luke character was the first guy associated with the mafia, but we saw the Frank Smith character. We saw people, and I got into some. I will talk about retcons. I've gotten into many arguments. I said Luke came on as a hitman. A lot of people don't remember that, and they argue with me. And I say, you can go to the EmmyLegends.org, and Tony Geary himself there talks about Luke, and he was a hitman. We didn't see him kill anyone online, but that was his profession when he was brought on. So Monty, as we said, sort of revolutionized it. And was everyone else sort of piggybacking off of General Hospital for the next decade?
Yeah, I would say so. I think what you brought up is really interesting because I think if you go back to 70s, if you look at blaxploitation and exploitation and sort of these grindhousey films that were sort of being shown everywhere, the anti-hero was a really big deal in the 70s. And so I think Gloria Monty sort of responded to that with Luke. And I was reading somewhere that Anthony Geary didn't want to do General Hospital. They had actually worked together on what is My Golden Chalice, made-for-TV movie that aired late at night called Sorority Kill. And I think that's where they met. And then she was really impressed with his performance in that, and he was like, I don't want to do a soap opera, and he says, I don't like them, and she said, I don't like them either, let's come and change things. And that's what she did. But I think the anti-hero thing, now I don't know enough about the other soaps in the late 70s to comment, but I really feel like maybe he set the trademark for that sort of character, and I think people warmed to that because at the time, if you look at the 70s, there was a lot of distrust in government, things were really turbulent, and there was something about the anti-hero that was really appealing to people as compared to the supposedly moral good guy who we find out has been doing all this evil stuff behind our backs this whole time.
Yeah.
Right. It was a sort of new introduction of action and adventure. Obviously, the sci-fi element. There was Casey the Alien a few years back. And so Gloria Monty revolutionized things. And again, the ratings shot through the roof. Other shows, and so there is sort of mimicry that happens inevitably, I think.
And the odd thing too is when we're talking about sex, violence, as in other things, is almost never mentioned. But the whole Frank Smith storyline on General Hospital, there was a lot of violence and shooting that I don't think had been seen before. And then right before that, Luke had actually raped Laura because he had to kill the DA. So he was all upset, got drunk, and Laura came in, bang, they rape him, and the famous scene of him pulling her down to the floor as the camera stays there. But yet, what's really odd is you would get characters who would get all moralistic about race. They would not necessarily have black characters, but everyone seemingly was tolerant of people of other races or whatnot, but they would have these characters like Luke or Todd Manning, and they would something would happen, and all of a sudden they'd be accepted as if everything was forgotten. It was always just bizarre to me how such a despicable character as Luke, as he first came on, became this beloved character until years later when Tony Geary got enough power and he decided to trash Luke again.
Well, and it's hard. The writers and producers respond to what works, right? And so Roger Howarth was supposed to be a short-term character. Anthony Geary was supposed to be a short-term character. And they just resonated in really unexpected ways with the audience. And so, from an economic perspective, absolutely they responded to that. But I understand what you're saying about the audience conundrum, and I don't quite know what to make of it, even as I was someone who loved the Tom Manning, loves the Tom Manning character, loved the Luke Geary character, even while knowing their history.
Yeah, I think when you spend that much time with the character, I think the metaphor is that anybody can be redeemed, which is something that people relate to. So they do things that you would never consider doing, but in the end, they are able to change their ways, and we see them do it, and so there's something kind of positive about that. But I think sometimes if you try to erase what they did, and I don't know that they necessarily did that with Todd Manning, I think that hung over him better than it did with Luke. So it was more successful to me. But I like the idea that nobody is completely evil. I think there's something really complex about that you don't get in prime time because you don't spend as much time with those characters. So I think that that's okay, and I think that the audiences might be approaching it from that state of mind as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of ABC soap's sort of three leading man rapists, Todd Manning was all. But seriously, Todd Manning was they never tried to erase it. Luke, they erased it, then brought it back, and the Sonny Corinthos character, he's totally been forgotten, even though he's become a terrorist and a mob boss since. They won't admit that he was drugging young girls. But anyway, let's pause here and let's talk about the golden age of soap operas, the 1980s and 90s, and we'll do that in a moment. Talking about soap operas with Lee Harrington and Amanda Reyes, and we're sort of up to what I consider the golden age of soap operas, the 1980s. I guess I consider the 90s sort of the silver age, and for me, this century has been just a steady decline, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Obviously, the beginning for about a decade, General Hospital ruled. It had ratings that were higher than just about anything else. I did a game show with Amanda about last year where we were talking about the popularity of the Match Game having the highest ratings. But then along came General Hospital in the early 80s with the mob storyline, then the Ice Princess storyline, which was a science fiction storyline that ended up with Luke and Laura getting married and Elizabeth Taylor coming online. So let's talk about the 1980s in general, because this is when a lot of soaps, not only the ABC soaps, but a lot of soaps started doing action shooting outside. They'd have the high adventure, what we'd call high concept storylines, aliens, possession. Marlene, I think, was possessed in the 1980s on Days of Our Lives. Susan Lucci had a number of bizarre storylines. Let's just talk. What changed in the 1980s? Was it the zeitgeist of America, escapism from Ronald Reagan's new Eisenhower kind of outlook, or what?
Well, all TV was very escapist back then, it seemed to me. Like, it was all about, like, the rich and the beautiful. Like, even if you just look at primetime, like, I'm thinking of Hotel, Love Boat. I mean, all those shows were just about people sort of luxuriating in, like, beautiful places, and, like, romance was huge. And
Love in the Afternoon was the tagline.
Yeah, and there was a lot of intrigue, too. Like, there's a TV show called Masquerade, which is pretty good, very short-lived. That was sort of about, it was escapism and fantasy. And I do think Laura Monti fed into that better than probably anybody else during that decade. It felt like everybody else was sort of doggy paddling, trying to catch up to what she was doing. And it became more cinematic in a way. Like, I know One Life to Live did a lot of location shoots. Batterley, I don't know if Batterley Island was, there was one where, Megan went somewhere, and there was like Sarah was going to marry a prince, and they shot it like in Budapest or somewhere. And so everything was really beautiful, and but I think that was prevalent in prime time too. I don't know that it was escapism so much, because I feel like in the Reagan era, people really felt comfortable with where they were in terms of, we didn't understand that trickle down really didn't work, and there was sort of this idea that we were all doing really well. Yeah. And also some of it was in your face to the Cold War, right? Look how we live here. So product was being produced that could be shown around the world. And actually a really good example of that is the primetime soap. But somebody, of course I can't remember the name of it now, somebody just made a documentary called Hotel Dallas, which is actually about, there was a country in the 80s that fell under communist rule, and they were only allowed 3 hours of TV, and I think the first 2 hours were state-run, where they just showed government and process, and the third hour was Dallas. And the reason why they showed Dallas was because they thought the people would be so upset by, like, oh, they're so extravagant, and they just spend their money willy-nilly, and they don't care, and blah, blah, blah. But it captivated the entire country, and JR became sort of a hero to them, and a celebrity. And there was a guy who lived in, I wish I could remember the name of the country, who started like a sunflower seed oil company, and he became the JR of that country. Like, he was actually called JR, and he built a hotel that was supposed to be a replicant of South Fork. But it only looks like South Park on the outside. It's all overgrown, and the inside it was Yugoslavian or something, had this really weird interior. And so somebody made a documentary about this just in the last 2 years that lived during this time of communism. And the documentary actually incorporates Patrick Duffy during the dream season. And he comes and does his own voiceover. It's a really amazing, weird film. It's very surreal. And they have little kids reenacting his death. And then his rebirth, which is what the country was going through when communism was overthrown. And it was all at the heart of it was the fact that the government thought that Dallas was going to show people the horrors of capitalism, and instead they embraced it. And I feel like the underlying theme of TV in the 80s was we embrace capitalism.
Yeah, Bobby's shower scene was sort of the primetime soap equivalent of the Luke and Laura wedding. That's the thing everyone talked about that decade.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah, you had lavish budgets, which also meant you had deep writing teams. You could hire those continuity experts. You also had quality soap storytelling during that era. So it's both these beautiful people living beautiful lives, very well done. And so I think you have quality story writing or storytelling, and it's just sort of a different sort of feel and aesthetic of soaps. It just really synced with the population.
Yeah, I want to talk about the writing now because I think the writing was really terrific. But I want to also tie this in with another trope that I didn't mention earlier for a reason, and that is the evil twin trope that's been around soap operas for a long time. Right. In the 1980s, at least on ABC, and I'm probably sure there were evil twins on the other network soaps too. The two that come to mind are All My Children's David Canary. He won 4 straight Best Actor awards for playing Adam and Stuart Chandler. And Stuart, if we want to talk about minorities, it's interesting because he was, I think, maybe the first mentally retarded character that became, not a leading character, but he was a prominent character. And his wife then died of AIDS when he got remarried and whatnot. And David Canary did such a fantastic job because it put a spin on that evil twin thing, because Adam was a bad guy in a sense, but he wasn't really evil, whereas Stuart was incessantly good, even though with his mental limitations. Let me just ask you both first on the David Canary character. Or characters.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think Stuart was the ability for, Adam to be redeemed. Stuart was the redeeming, like the representation of the redeeming side of Adam. And I don't remember Stuart's impairment ever being labeled. I don't remember.
I think he would probably be called somewhere on the autistic spectrum now, probably.
Right.
Yeah.
I think now, and I think we viewers tended to see him as just sort of a simpler, good person. Like we knew he was cognitively different, but I don't remember him having a diagnosis.
Yeah.
But again, I loved that. I loved both of those characters. I watched for years, and I always, at least personally, did see Stewart as the redemption of Adam, the living redemption of Adam.
Yeah.
I always just see them as mirrors of each other, like these two paths you could take in life. I mean, that's how I see evil twins in general and the good twin. It's like the same person but different choices. You know what I mean? Although I guess that would be different with David Canary because he was obviously had something that made him different. You know what I mean? Yeah. But usually when I see like the evil twins, I see it more as like a one character split in two.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
I want to talk about another set of evil and good twin, but it relates to my recent interview with Brian Patrick Clark in General Hospital. And I think the best storyline I ever saw in General Hospital was what's called the Prometheus story. It was the last full story Tony Geary did before he left the show or was involved in. And basically, it was about the Cold War, and we got an introduction of a KGB-like crew, and Clark played the Mole, who was an agent in General Hospital, and he was actually a good guy in a bad situation. And the fascinating thing they did was he had replaced a character we'd never seen before, and then they had him come back as the original character, who's a psychopathic killer. And so you had a guy who started out as a seemingly bad guy is actually good, and then the initial guy is the bad guy, and they're not really twins because the Russian guy was made up to look like the bad guy, and it was a fascinating twist. And that story was so good because it took the death of Laura, it took the Holly and Robert and Luke triangle, it took this spy story, and it took 2 or 3 other minor stories, and sort of like a bunch of tornadoes that melded into one great story. It really, to me, was soap story writing at its finest. Let me just ask you about if either of you remember that storyline, because to me it's General Hospital's best written story of all time.
Go ahead, Lee.
No, I do remember, I was watching at that time, I remember the story, I don't remember that level of nuance. I remember as a viewer being genuinely surprised, like truly surprised by what was unfolding,
yeah.
and thinking of it as yet awesome storytelling. But you're reminding me of some details I hadn't remembered until you mentioned them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amanda. What was it?
I don't think I remember the storyline as well, but I think you brought up a really good point about like really good soap story is a story that when it explodes, it brings in other stories to it. Like somehow they all get tied together.
Yeah.
And soaps actually do that quite often. I don't know that I can give a specific example, but all these stories are happening, and then there's this one story that just kind of like keeps going this way, and all the other stories are heading in its direction, so that when it hits a point, you find out that all these people have been affected by this one thing. And it's so, when that happens, it's kind of mind-blowing, and it's really amazing the way the timelines have been brought together to crash into another major story, and then it branches like this, and then it comes together again. I mean, that's how soap should be to me.
And we talked. I mentioned the ADD editing. I mentioned the ADD editing early, and one of the things that I think has ruined storytelling nowadays is block taping, because you'll have characters on soap operas, at least on General Hospital, that disappear for a month and you don't see them. Whereas in the old days, in the 80s, there was at least one day a week, even during the Luke and Laura hysteria. Luke and Laura would be on 4 days a week, but there would be that Wednesday or Thursday where we would see the minor characters, and they would be, it would help weave them into the stories. You would have 3rd or 4th level characters that you got to like. And when they came on 3 or 4 times a month, you'd be like, oh, I want to see what they're doing. You don't, that seems to be gone now, and that seems an essential part of soaps.
No, that's a Ron Carlivati invention. He wanted Port Charles to feel more like a city, and so he sort of created like a telenovela format within the soap structure. So he wanted to focus on specific characters for a block of time, and then focus on another specific character for a block of time. But if you watch Young and the Restless, I'm not so sure about the other 2 shows. You're gonna get what you were just talking about. It's different per soap. I do know that Bold and the Beautiful is a good example of how to make things. And I can't remember the name of the threesome, but Steffi, Liam and Wyatt have been a threesome, like a love triangle for years, and they're compelling to people. And so you're not getting, like, they don't disappear for long periods of time. They're always there.
Okay.
And Brooke, of course, is always there. But, like, I think what Ron was trying to do was telenovelas were so popular because you're talking about ADD sort of ideas, that telenovelas have a very specific beginning, middle, and end, and people were really enjoying that aspect of them. So he was trying to incorporate that while having long storyline arcs. There were still these stories that culminated in a period of 3 or 4 weeks, and then we went on to another group of people dealing with their stories while these other major stories carried over. So that's actually a Ron creation, I think, and not necessarily a staple.
Well,
I think I remember reading that depending on the show that you're talking about and the era, that budgetary considerations came into that a little bit too. So there are some actors who contractually they couldn't afford to put on more than X number of times a week. So a little bit of that, but that's interesting. Yeah.
well, let's move to the 1990s. I sort of call that the Silver Age of soap, because that seemed to be the last time soaps. There were still a few episodes, special episodes that would air in prime time. It was still considered a serious medium. I interviewed a soap actor a few months ago named Sean Kanan, who's been on a number of shows.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Sean Kanan said he believes that the decline of soap operas started with the O.J. Simpson trial. That soap operas couldn't compare with the real life. I don't know if that's totally true, but what do you think the impact of the O.J. Fiasco was in the mid-90s? And do you guys think that it might have contributed to people moving away from soap operas here in the U.S.?
It did because it preempted the soaps, first of all, so people kind of got lost in the storylines, and it was reality that was just as dramatic as anything any of the soaps were doing. So in a way, without intentionally realizing it, by airing all of that, it may have been the birth of reality television. I mean, when you think about it, because it was putting in something that was super dramatic, and then people got caught up in this, but it's real kind of idea behind it. So yeah, I do think it deeply impacted soaps.
And I totally agree with that. I mean, viewers, disappeared for months and just did not come back. Just came back. You had both real life and a celebrity's real life, and I think, the launch. Interesting argument about the launch of reality television, because certainly the late '90s are marked by rise of reality, rise of lifestyle programming, both cheaper to produce than soap operas, and just a significant shift in what we were seeing during the daytime.
That's just another reason to hate O.J. Simpson, by the way.
So it seemed then for the next dozen or so years after that, a lot of the old-time soaps started just withering away. What did they all fall because of the same reason, do you think? Or was there a multitude of reasons why, I guess, Guiding Light or All My Children failed? Or did they fail for the same reasons, do you think, ultimately?
I think for different reasons. In part, P&G was gradually pulling out of soaps, and that impacted their shows differently. Another World, I think, went off the air, but then, what was it called? Sunset Beach came on the air. And so there was an attempt to launch some new programs, Passions from Sunset Beach and Port Charles. Some of these stalwart shows disappeared. So maybe it was an effort to reinvent soap opera for a different kind of audience. But yeah, the late 90s was definitely a turning point.
Yeah, I just think the ratings weren't there anymore, I guess because of OJ, and because in the 80s, younger people started watching, but it was so hard to figure out how to marry both audiences together. These older generations who were used to these domestic dramas, and the younger generation who were looking for the Faison or the grand adventures that they were having on General Hospital. And so, and to this day, they still struggle with how to get both audiences to watch. And I feel like the older soaps, maybe stuck in their traditions, had a harder time keeping up with something like Sunset Beach, which I never watched, but I remember it was high in glamour. It was about the beautiful people, and that was attracting the young audiences. But then the older traditional audiences were alienated by that, so that's why those shows didn't last either. Right.
Well, we've talked about the external forces. Let me posit the two soaps that I watched the most, All My Children and General Hospital. I think there were internal things that turned off a lot of fans. On the All My Children, the two biggest obvious things were, one, that as she got older, Susan Lucci seemed to get more megalomaniacal, and every good-looking young stud that came onto the show had to hop in her bed within 3 months of appearing. And it got to the point of ridiculousness where you'd have this, at the time, I guess, 60-year-old woman bedding 25-year-old hunks, and they would respond. And then, of course, there was...
Go for it.
Yeah, and then there was the other guy played by Cameron Matheson, who became one of the most obnoxious characters on that show. So I think there was bad writing there. Did either of you watch All My Children in that era? And what do you think of my diagnosis about over too much Erica Kane and too much I forget the character's name, Lavery, Ryan Lavery?
Yeah, I watched All My Children until the end, and it, in my era of watching, it always was the Erica show, so it was always going to be the Erica show, and yeah, I don't know if the actress didn't want to embrace
aging.
Embrace her age, embrace her aging, and so I don't know where to point the finger for the way the story's evolved, but it was just sort of like, what the heck? I watched because AMC was one of my soaps, not because I thought the storytelling was particularly compelling.
Yeah.
But
was that a Charles Pratt? Or are we talking about the Charles Pratt era? Because he came in and he's the one I think who poisoned Dixie, right, with the pancakes. And I liked writing on Young and the Restless, but he got a lot of crap because he was right there at the end of All My Children, and he was sort of handed the blame.
Yeah, I think so.
For it. But if we could talk for a second about ageism in soaps, I think one thing that soaps do really well, and at least on General Hospital and Young and the Restless today, is that they keep older characters fairly relevant. I think Young and the Restless probably does it a little better, and it's kind of nice to see people like Victor Newman. The actor's 74, and he's running an empire, you know what I mean? But it's interesting that the audiences will take Jack, who's in his 60s, the actor, having sex with all kinds of younger women. But if the character who plays his sister, played by Eileen Davidson, is currently like maybe gonna have a romance with this younger man, people flip their lids over it. And so when you talk about Erica Kane, and I didn't watch during this era, but when you talk about Erica Kane being in her 60s and betting young men, that's so subversive and wonderful. Like nobody.
If it had been done well, I'd agree with you.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, in general, just to have that, to me, I see it as subversive. I see it as really cool, and I see it as like a in your face to what women have to deal with all the time when they get older. That you don't have to lose your sexuality or your relevancy. Now, I agree if it's better written, but I think Young and the Restless is really well written, and I still see the pushback to it. So I feel like when they're doing that, it's subversive. I can't think of another word for it. So I admire that. But you're right. I mean, people don't like to watch it. There's something about it. And I think if she's betting everybody, then maybe. So somebody who did it really well would be Dorian. Dorian did have her and Mel. Oh my God, Mel. Who didn't love Mel? But she had Mark Schneider. I can't remember the name of the character. He was the guy with the ponytail. She had an affair with him. And of course, she married David Vickers, who was, at least a decade and a half younger than her. And they were wonderful together. And she kind of did it in a way that I think people were more accepting of it. But she was a man-eater. Let's face it. Yeah. And she, but I love that sexual relevancy of her. It's like, I'm not going to lay down because I turned 60. Well, she did lay down, I guess, is exactly what she did. But you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, there's something really empowering to me to hear you talk about it and say, like, well, she was sleeping with every 25-year-old man. Well, that has to equate that a 25-year-old man likes to sleep with her. Well, why? She's beautiful, she's confident, she's powerful. And that's amazing to me. That's amazing to me to see that on television in the 90s and today.
Well, as far as ageism, General Hospital, I think, has been abysmal, just like with the minorities. I know a lot of fans of the show on web boards make some horrendous comments about, say, Leslie Charlton, Monica Quartermain, or Jacqueline Zeman, Bobby Spencer, and about some of the sort of, I guess, botched surgery they may have had in terms of nips and tucks and whatnot. But I do think they have a long history going back to when I first started watching with, say, John Berardino's character and some of the older original characters being sidelined and just being tokenized. But I think General Hospital, at the turn of the century through now, has just gotten, the writing for me has just been so bad. And it gets back to the character of the Sonny Corinthos and the Sonny, Carly, Jason axis of evil, where you have these horrendously horrid, amoral, immoral, unethical, mass murderers, psychopaths, and the whole ethos of that show has been flipped upside down. I think it started probably with the Luke character, but then by the time Sonny became the main character of that show, I mean, I've known so many ex-General Hospital fans who refuse to watch it because Sonny can rape, he can murder, he can blow Jax's plane out of the sky as a terrorist. He can do all of these horrible things. But there's always some other guy who's worse. If some other character utters a racist comment, there's Saint Sonny decrying racism, even though he's murdered millions.
Well, I have two comments about that. So before I lose track of my thought, so you have to understand that Sonny is a response to The Sopranos. So when The Sopranos got really big, I think the General Hospital decided to do a more mob focus, and they've never been able to crawl out of that hole they built for themselves. But it was actually a response to what was happening in television that was prevalent, and they were trying to cash in on it because they already had a history of it. Yeah. So I don't necessarily disagree with the things you're saying about Sonny, but at the same time, I understand where it's coming from. And Sonny is, I don't know what board you're going on, but my experience with fans and Sonny is that they love him and they can't get enough of him. And I do think he's a really interesting, complex character, and I do think he does have some contradictions, which we all do. But at the same time, I want to comment, this is just one scene, I'm not expecting anybody to remember, but when they kind of brought Scotty and Lucy back in the last couple of years, they, and then that love triangle started with Bobby. Before that really took effect, when she was married to Kevin, she started having an affair with Scotty, and there was this scene where she came to Scotty's apartment, which was, I think, a hotel, and she was kind of, deciding how she felt, and they started kissing, and they took it one step further and slept together, and there's this really poignant moment where they're both sitting on the bed, and he's opening her blouse or whatever, and he stops for a second to get her consent, and she does this nod, and then he just keeps going, and that kind of like legacy between those characters, that sort of beautiful moment about is this what you really want, is so poignant to me. And so I understand that like maybe they could do more with the older characters, but what they're doing with the older characters when they're there, I think speaks to me more than anything that like Sam and Jason are doing. Like I don't mind them, but like I live for those little moments, and there's something that General Hospital does that's so beautiful in those moments that I think is unique and wonderful, and it makes it okay for the rest of the show,
And when those moments are done well, that's what makes soap opera such a wonderful genre, right? And fans will live for those moments, and sometimes they're decades apart, sometimes they're a long time apart. But soaps can do them so well, and it is that narrative history and just the historical archives internally that soaps can draw on that makes soaps so special. I mean, I do understand that for people who don't like Sonny, it can be hard to watch General Hospital, but there are lots and lots of people, as Amanda said, who are huge Sonny fans.
Yeah, I know. Well, they are, but I think I talked earlier, the sort of disconnect. I find it just really incredible that in the 80s, when we didn't have the internet, the soap seemed to be far more responsive to the fans' desires. And nowadays they don't seem to be. And I find that Maurice Bernard has become sort of the male Susan Lucci, in that he's always on. And people, there are fans who will post numbers of appearances per year. He's led General Hospital for like the last 15 years. But let me just talk about, we mentioned telenovelas and Love in the Afternoon in the 80s. We really don't get as much sex now, as we did in the 80s, or with people ripping their clothes off or whatnot. And yet, I live in Texas, and so I have channels, and you see all the Spanish and Mexican soap operas, the telenovelas, and we see Sofia Vergara clones. We see, the handsome Latino lover, and it's like I don't even know what the hell these people are saying. But in many ways, I'm like, boy, this is a lot more interesting than just watching, Maurice Bernard stutter and go, I killed someone, I got caught in an affair or whatnot. I'd rather see.
Dan, you need to stop watching General Hospital. It's driving you insane. I don't know how to help you.
A little, 2 or 3 Sofia Vergara clones on GH would be the ticket.
Well, sure. But I think that shows what we were talking about, the push and pull between the soaps, in that they have these two different audiences they're trying to reconcile with, and that's the young audience that they need to hold on to, not just for demographics, but because the old audience is dying off. And so there's a dance there where they have to figure out, well, what works. And so for everybody that says they want love and romance, there's somebody else who wants more intrigue. And so I think fandom is, I have a love-hate relationship with them, and I really feel like sometimes it's out of control. I don't think fans should dictate how stories go, because
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of times, some of the stuff you read on these boards, well, like for instance, Summer, a character in Young and the Restless, got married, and very young, and the whole story was, of course, the marriage didn't last, but that was the whole point of it, right? And they were like, well, why didn't she just go to college? Oh, because that's so compelling on a soap. You can't have that on a soap. So you can't demand these things. So soap is supposed to reflect real life, but it has to do it in a way that's compelling. And also, I think it's important that characters make bad choices, because there's something about us watching other people do bad things that we enjoy. Oh, well, I would never do that. There's like a very interesting thing we have going on inside of us. So you're seeing the writers and the producers try to keep the audience interested, but at the same time the audience is so diverse in and of itself. How do they do that? And so therein is your struggle. So what you're seeing with Sunny is like them trying to figure out how to please both sides, right?
But isn't the formula though sex sells? I mean, when I look at these telenovelas and don't know what's going on, but I see a 25-year-old Sofia Vergara in a virtual body stocking, you know, I go, you know.
Oh, I agree, but I do feel like there is a new morality that you see where people don't necessarily want to watch it quite like that, and I feel like they want more. They want it to be more than just romance. Now, granted, if it was all romance, I'd be super happy. But I like, in Young and the Restless, there are two corporations, the Abbott, corporation, and the Victor Newman corporation, and they go up against each other all the time. And then there's Spenmore's, and and so you get a lot of business in there. And there's a Brash and Sassy, the new business, and of course, I'm thinking of I can't remember Jill's company, Chancellor's, and there's something really intriguing about that. And Bold and Beautiful is all about the fashion industry, so they do have plenty of sex. I mean, they have very beautiful people on that show, and it's very sexy. But they also have the inner workings of the fashion industry. So, I mean, I think you can't have just one, to be honest with you.
Well, and I wonder, I'd be curious as to whether ratings in which people have sex are higher, or ratings or episodes in which there are weddings. Like, the weddings outrank sex. And that would be interesting to me to know, are audiences seeking the romance, or are they seeking sex? What combination they're in? I think wedding episodes are still huge.
They're super huge. They do entire articles about them in Soaps in Depth. So, yeah, and they're not necessarily the sex scenes they're talking about. They're talking about the weddings. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's talk about online, because the internet has had a couple of attempts at making a serialized soap operas. I think the most successful has been something called The Bay. I've only seen maybe 1 or 2 episodes. Famously or infamously, after All My Children and One Life to Live were canceled, ABC sold the rights to Prospect Park, a company which put on about a year later. I think they put All My Children 5 years into the future, even though only a year had passed, and then One Life to Live came back. And I thought the One Life to Live was much better done than the All My Children one. I think they couldn't get enough All My Children actors, so they did a lot of recasts, and then there was a lawsuit with ABC. Some of the One Life to Live characters had gone on to General Hospital. Todd and McBain, probably the 2 most popular characters, and also the star Manning, who was not a popular character, went to GH. And she was popular on One Life to Live. People hated her on GH. Facts are facts, Amanda. And maybe it's the actors, but then the lawsuit came and it botched everything. Is the future, do you think, online for soaps, or what?
Well, I think Prospect Park was really forward-thinking, and I think they were just 2 years too early, because now everybody streams stuff, and it seems more accessible. At the time, it was really difficult, and I know this because I spent a lot of time on Facebook on the boards trying to get people to watch. They didn't understand what Hulu was. It was often called Zulu. It had all these different names. Nobody understood how to access it. Nobody understood what it meant. Nobody wanted to watch on their computer or their phone, and it was a real struggle. But now everybody watches stuff online, and people just go on Hulu like it's nothing, and they plug in their soaps or whatever show they want to watch, and they put it on. And so Prospect Park had something is going again. And I'm a huge Prospect Park cheerleader, so I'm going to put that out there, because that was a very valiant attempt they made to save 2 beloved shows. I personally think All My Children was better than One Life to Live, and that's saying something, because I'm a huge One Life to Live fan, because they did really dark stories. That girl that got kidnapped and she had to have the abortion. I mean, that was so well handled, and I really, really liked the structure of that show. I think One Life to Live really struggled with the stories. They really picked up towards the end, but they had, like, speaking of stunt casting, they had Snoop Dogg come on, which was traditional for One Life to Live. Like, he was smoking pot with Bo's son, and it was the things that people did. There was actually, in the first scene of One Life to Live, there was a blowjob scene. I don't know if you guys remember that, at the club, and people were instantly alienated by, like, how hip it got, and
well,
it took a
I
while
think
to find its footing.
I think the thing, though, the JR character on All My Children was woefully miscast from Jacob Young. I don't even remember the guy who played him on the online version. Whereas I thought that the One Life to Live, they were doing the thing with the cult when they brought back the two Todds. The two Todd storyline ended the network run. They were going to explain things there, and then they had some cult. So this, to me, brought me back to the 1980s. I thought had it continued, we would have had a really good story there. But
I would agree with that. But I think, dramatically speaking, watching the two, I was more compelled by what was happening on All My Children. But like I said, One Life to Live really started to kick into gear. It also it looked like it had a lower budget allotted to it. I feel like Prospect Park put their money in All My Children, because even though One Life to Live was doing a little better in the ratings, I think All My Children historically was the more popular show.
Yeah.
So they were sort of putting a lot of more money into it. The sets looked a little better to me. It felt like they had more room to move around. And they opened with an exterior shot with the guy driving down the road to Pine Valley. And I don't know that One Life to Live was allotted a lot of those. They did eventually. I think Matthew went to a house and it was shot outdoors, but it was a little more static. And also, I remember Victoria's office was like a desk. It looked like a bedroom. It was so weird the way they designed things. But they had a lot more core characters. They had Taya and the Todds and, of course, Blair. I mean, it was wonderful, but it struggled, and they didn't have the money that they needed. I don't think that they really understood how expensive and how difficult it was to put a soap together. So they had to work against that. And then there were some union problems that they had. But in terms of, and I know I'm talking too much here, but I really followed this whole thing. In terms of what they did, it was really amazing with how far they got with it. And it's just sad that it happened just literally 2 years before people really got into watching.
Yeah, I was really disappointed that they didn't succeed. But how about you, Lee? What are your thoughts on it?
I didn't follow All My Children online. I did follow One Life to Live online, and I remember being shocked by the language, and it was the attempt to be more hip and thinking, "Wow, they can say that now." And so it did have a different feel, and I'm sure that it attracted maybe some new viewers or viewers, and definitely drove some other ones away. And I know from my experience trying to watch that, it just, it was on 4 days a week, and it was on 3 days a week, and then how many days is it on? And it just got a little confusing from a viewer's perspective. But I do agree with Amanda that a couple of years later, it wouldn't have seemed such a wild song. But I do applaud Prospect. Thank you for trying to save these legacy shows, and I'm so gone.
Well, go ahead.
I have not really watched any of the made-for online sites. I've dipped in for an episode. I haven't been following those at all, really.
So where do either of you think soap operas are going? Do you think, is it just a matter of the last four dominoes falling, and then TV's going to be? Because I hate that show, The Chew. I want to throttle those people. I hate that Daphne Oz the most. Then fat ass Batali. I just want to choke him.
You hate so much, Dan. You hate so much.
I know. Well, as bad as Susan Lucci got, I'll take Susan Lucci and Erica Kane over Mario Batali any day. But
I was delighted that Days of Our Lives contract just got renewed for another year. Again, there was all this fear that Megyn Kelly's shift would knock it off, and I'm sure each of the networks has some baseline of ratings, baseline of viewership, and if it dips below that for too long, the shows might be gone. I'm heartened by the stable but smaller community of viewers that's still there. I hope they're on forever. I think that's an optimistic statement.
Do you think Netflix or Hulu is the play? If there's going to be a new soap launch, do you think it's Netflix or Hulu and not the networks?
Oh, for sure. I wouldn't be so... Well, if you think about it, Tyler Perry's kind of doing it on basic cable, right? He's doing the Have and Have Nots, and I feel like he has another show with Kelly Sullivan, and I can't remember the name of it. And so there are some channels that aren't the major networks that are kind of interested in that sort of storytelling. But I do think that shows like The Bay, which I have not seen but I have followed, are doing really interesting things in terms of they're bringing a lot of familiar faces to the soaps. It's amazing the amount of actors that they've gotten that I just recognize, and there's that one show. What was the soap? It had a lesbian couple. It was on CBS. And when the show got canceled, the two actresses did a Kickstarter. Do you know what I'm talking about? And they raised money to continue their storyline, but they changed the character names, and they actually raised money to continue their story completely independently because they were such a popular couple. And I can't remember I have to research that. But so the thing is that when you take it off the networks, you've got a wide range of options that you didn't have, and that is you can fund it through you can get crowdsource it, which seems to work, and I think that there are some online soaps that do that. Or you can do it in a really smaller way, and there are some soaps. There's all these like weird online soaps. I can never figure out how to watch them. That's the problem, because they don't come on Hulu. Like if you go on the Bay, you get the page, but you can't get the full episodes. And now they're on Amazon Prime now, so they're much more accessible. But they're doing these things in different ways. They do different funding sources, and what's so great about that is that the executive in charge is the person most passionate about the project. It's not necessarily about the dollar signs. It's about their vision, as compared to a network who's got this guy in a suit leaning over everybody. You know, when One Life to Live was canceled, I remember Mark Lawson had said what a relief it was, because for the last 2 years they'd had just somebody standing over them looking at everything they did. And once it got canceled, they were like, just do whatever you're going to do. Just be sure you're done by this date. And that last year, One Life to Live was untouchable.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? So when you start doing it independently, you've opened up so many doors for yourself.
Was the Kelly Sullivan that you mentioned the actress from General Hospital a few years ago?
Yes.
Okay.
And then Young and the Restless. Yeah. She's a wonderful actress. I can't remember the name of the show, but it looks horrible. But Tyler Perry's producing it, and it's really popular.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let me just as we wrap up here, let me just talk about online. Since Amanda, you said that you've gone on to I guess a lot of web boards and whatnot. It seems to me that there is a demand. There are still fans out there. What do you think is needed to hook people into? Let's say if Netflix does a year or two from now start up a new soap opera, what do you think is going to be needed to hook into it? Is the format, is the genre going to have to change for the times significantly, and what might those changes be?
I don't think that they need to change that much. So I'm going to lean on Young and the Restless for this, but it's harder when the soap is new, because what Young and the Restless, so now Young and the Restless has Mal Young producing it, and he came from England, and he did Coronation Street or one of those soaps, and so he has a history of a different type of storytelling, but he's really interested in legacy. So if you watch Young and the Restless, you'll notice that they're employing a lot more flashbacks, and they're doing the Catherine storyline, and they're dating back decades now into like these crazy stories that started then and wrapping them up now, and there's a mix there, you know, of business intrigue and very realistic. I say it's so much different than General Hospital in the terms that there's a real sense of realism to what's happening. And they also have a really nice balance between the romances and this business storylines. And so I feel like I've never thought about starting a new soap, but I think that if you're going to, you have to look and see what audiences are responding to. And Young and the Restless is still the most popular soap on television, and it gets double the numbers that General Hospital gets and Days of Our Lives. And I think you need to look at what they're doing. Now, of course, they're leaning a lot on legacy, which you can't do if you have a new soap. But I think if you can find a balance between something that's intriguing and interesting, like a business world, and something that really plays on the domestic, because I still think people are responding to that, and get them together, you could probably have a pretty good show.
Yeah.
And I agree with that content-wise, and I've always thought the U.S. has missed the mark in not producing, short-form storytelling. So the telenovela-like format. So, primetime scheduling has gotten so diverse over the past 5 years that viewers might be open to, 60 episodes, right? Soaps that do have a beginning, middle, and end, and are on for 3 and then disappear. And there might be an audience for, programming on television in ways that there aren't for other serials on television.
Well,
formats.
Yeah. My final point, and then I'll end with a closing segment to give you your final views. You mentioned, Amanda mentioned how I was being driven crazy by the Sunny storylines on General Hospital. But whenever I see something, and for the 978th time, a character does the same thing, and I roll my eyes and whatnot. But there are a lot of people that online on these fan boards really get obsessive, and I'm probably going to one day do a show on just internet trolls. But it seems that some people get so attached to a character that they just lose all bearings. Years ago, had there been the internet, I'm sure that there would have been people who would have denied that Luke ever raped Laura, because I know they did it in person. That they would have just been saying terrible things about people. I mentioned earlier Luke as a hitman, and I mentioned there's a Emmy TV Legends interview where Geary admits it, and I remember I argued with him, and I pointed it to that 2 minutes and 12 seconds into it. Geary says he came onto the show as a hitman. What are you talking about? But there are people that there are people that don't want to admit that their favorite actor or their favorite character or their storyline, and I'll see all of these bizarre permutations. What do you think it is about the soap opera fan that makes them so rabid about it? And has that sort of died off? Is the problem not with soap operas, but just that the American person or fan has just not as passionate as they were?
Well, that's the comment on fandom. I mean, fandom in general, like if you know anybody who's into comics, like they'll tell you like Superman should be like this, and like he did this or whatever. I don't follow comics enough, but Batman does this, and they're way more obsessively passionate in some ways. I do think it still exists. I think it's super strong. I know for a fact that like Victor Newman is so controversial still to this day on Young and the Restless. People love to go back and forth on him. Some people love him, some people hate him, and they could go online and sometimes it's okay. So here's a good example of something. So without getting too controversial, but there was an actor fired from Young and the Restless a few years ago for supposedly sexually harassing someone, and then that was never made whether it was true or not. But he was let go from the show, and supposedly this actress had been the one who reported him, and so she was exposed. Like everybody knew who the actress was, and so she started getting a lot of hate mail. People were going on her Twitter and directly tweeting her that she was a slut and she was this and she was that, because they loved this actor so much. To this day, I mean, he's been off the show for like 3 or 4 years, and people still want him to come back. And I was reading an article about it, and in the comments section, and I actually took a still of it. Somebody said that she's obviously a whore, because do you remember that episode where she poured water on herself so that her blouse would be see-through? And then somebody responded and said, that's not the actress, that's the character. And he wrote, yeah, right. And the lines were definitely blurred of reality and fantasy for him. And I do think that exists, because obviously that brought it out. And so I don't think it's as intense as it was. A really good TV movie, I don't know if either one of you have seen it, it's called Fantasies. And it was about a woman who created a nighttime soap called Middleton. I think she was patterned after either Rita Lakin or Gloria Monty. And she was a really independent, filmmaker, producer. And people started killing off the characters on her soap in real life. And the thing is, they used real soap actors. Yeah. So Robert Woods is in it, Peter Bergman, and some other familiar face, Robin Matson's in it. And it was a lot about how people get obsessed with these actors. And so there's a scene with one of them, it might be Robin Matson shopping, and somebody follows her outside of the grocery store to tell her how horrible she was to a character, something to that extent. And there was a real blur between because you're watching these people 5 times a week, and you're getting to know them like you would know your neighbor or somebody living in your own home. And for some people, it becomes really vague where the character ends and the actor starts, you know what I mean? Yeah, but I think it's still prevalent.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know whether it's the Network run or the Prospect Park run, and it must have been the Network, because I don't think Tuck Watkins did the Prospect Park, but towards the last year, Tuck Watkins was shown watching Fraternity Row, the One Life to Live fictionalized drama, and he's sitting there like eating popcorn, and then something happens, and he goes, "What?" And he starts yelling at the TV like an obsessed fan. It was a hilarious episode or scene.
Yeah.
But
That's exactly how I think it is. That was it. That was the end of the network run where they started
yeah,
getting really meta.
yeah, okay,
Meta. I mean, it was amazing. They did an episode of Fraternity Row with the actors. It was a full standalone
yeah,
episode of Fraternity
Yeah,
Row.
I remember that. Awesome.
yeah,
And it was wild. And what was so great about that storyline was, do you remember Roxy wanted to save the soap? She wanted to save Fraternity
yeah,
Row.
right.
And they're
Yeah.
and she goes to the studio, but they shoot everything in advance, and nobody was there. And I think she was with Tuck Watkins,
Yeah.
and she's so devastated that she can't see them. And he holds her hand, and they walk out of off the
Yeah,
stage.
that was
And
touching,
it
yeah.
tears in my eyes. It was so beautifully done. The way they melded reality and fantasy on that show. Oh, My Life to Live was the best. Let's just face it. Face it.
Well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give you both a chance to wrap up your final thoughts on soap operas, and we'll do that when we return. Finishing up my show with Amanda and Lee, I will link to Lee's university site, and I'll link to Amanda's blog as well, and I'll give them a final say so here, and then Amanda can shamelessly plug whatever she wants to. But Lee, let me just ask you, what are your final thoughts? Anything about the future, about soap operas in general? Anything maybe we've missed? Any comments?
No, again, for me personally, they've been the story of my life in a lot of ways. They've been with me since I was a teenager, and hopefully they'll be with me forever. And serialized storytelling, again, long precedes daytime soap operas, and presumably will long after daytime soap operas aren't around anymore, if they're not around anymore. I love the genre. I love the form. I'm a staunch defender till the dying days. And I hope they're still on TV for many years to come.
Amanda, you're on.
Yeah, just to echo Lee's statements, I think it's a really valuable form of storytelling. I wish people were more open to it. I do think it has a future. I think that the people that have stayed on are pretty loyal. You don't see a huge amount of change in the numbers. And I think that there are still more stories to tell. So at the beginning of this, I talked about a book I looked at called Worlds Without End. And that title is so compelling to me because that's exactly what soaps are. And there's so much beauty in having stories that go on forever and can go anywhere, and that which in some way directly reflect our lives. And something that's been on my mind, so I've been rewatching Someone Like to Live from the 1989 year, and I don't know how well you remember the show, but there was a character named Brenda who was a nurse, and she was pregnant. It all tied into that famous baby switch between Michael Grant's baby and hers that Gabriella did, and she thought her baby had died, and at the time she was dating Larry Woolley, and she was devastated, of course, and he said something so compelling to me. He said, because she had this wall up and she felt really isolated by the incident. And he said, I want to share in your sorrow. And soaps have kind of worked that way for me. They've been really cathartic on a lot of different levels. Characters have gone through things that I've gone through, and it's helped me, understand things, or it's helped me not feel so alone. That's another thing that soaps do for me. And I would like to see people sort of approach soaps if they're new to it. Sort of understanding that the format is sort of about exploring yourself while you explore what these characters are going through. I think that's really important.
Well, I had mentioned earlier on that my first regular soap had been this Australian soap opera, Prisoner Cell Block H, which frankly actually had the first lesbian character ever, an actress, I forget her name now, Carol something or other, played Frankie the lesbian, and they did some daring storylines. But General Hospital, in terms of just overall years, is probably my main soap opera. It sounds like, Amanda, your main one was One Life to Live, correct? And
Yes,
so Lee, what was your all-time favorite soap then?
General Hospital.
General Hospital? Okay, well, it looks like we're all ABC soap fans. So anyway, I want to thank both of you for being on, and I'll link to both of your websites below. So thank you very much.
Just real quick, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
This is my book coming out in May.
Hold it up
Sorry,
close. Hold it up closer to the camera. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. It's called Are You in the House Alone? A TV Movie Compendium, 1964 to 1999. And it has a bunch of stuff about TV movies in here. I didn't do as much about soap operas as I wanted, but speaking of something we didn't talk about that maybe we could do at some point later is Daytime After Dark, the TV movies where they where they purposely cast soap actors
Oh,
to
okay.
sell the film. Only Fantasies is in here if you're interested in reading about it. But if you like TV movies, pick it up.
Congratulations.
All right,
Thank
thank you.
you.